Thieves attack an elderly man in a wheelchair. What Keanu Reeves did is shocking. Keanu Reeves' hands trembled as he stared at the weathered box he'd just pulled from beneath the floorboards. 5 years. 5 years of running, of looking over his shoulder, of building a life away from Hollywood's spotlight. And now, standing in the attic of the isolated countryside home he'd purchased for his retirement, it had all caught up to him. "Keanu?" Antonio's voice drifted up from below. "There's someone here to see you." Keanu froze, the familiar cold dread spreading through his chest. They had found him again. He closed the box, filled with old newspaper clippings, surveillance photos, and a faded map with several locations circled in red, and slid it back into its hiding place. With practiced calm, he descended the narrow staircase to face his visitor. Antonio, the elderly man who had become his unlikely companion in this secluded life, stood uncertainly by the front door. Beside him was a tall man with calculating eyes that Keanu recognized instantly, despite having only seen him in photographs. "Hello, Mr. Reeves," the man said. No warmth colored his voice. "I'm Professor Vega. We have much to discuss." Antonio's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Keanu? It's okay, my friend. Could you give us a minute?" His voice was steady despite the earthquake happening inside him. Once Antonio reluctantly disappeared into the kitchen, the man stepped further into the house, his gaze taking in the modest furnishings, evidence of the simple life Keanu had, built far from the glamour of his former existence. "Professor," the title felt strange on his tongue, knowing what it represented. "How did you find me? Does it matter? You knew this day would come." He placed a manila envelope on the coffee table. "My organization has been tracking your activities for quite some time. We know about the tunnels now." The room seemed to tilt. The tunnels. Those words alone were enough to bring it all rushing back. The discoveries, the threats, the terrible choice he'd made, the reason he'd disappeared from public life. "I have a friend to protect," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "And we have interests to secure." The professor's eyes hardened. "Others will be arriving soon." Keanu moved to the window, scanning the countryside outside with the hyper-vigilance that had become second nature. "Are they coming now? Is that why you're here? A courtesy warning?" "No. I came alone." The professor's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "You have 12 hours before my associates arrive, for professional courtesy." Keanu turned to face him, seeing not just an adversary, but the embodiment of a threat he'd spent years preparing to confront. "What happened on this property isn't what you think." "Then tell me," the professor challenged. "After all this time hiding away, tell me what exactly you discovered about our operation." Beyond the window, storm clouds gathered over the rolling hills. In the distance, thunder rumbled, an ominous echo of a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. After years of preparation, Keanu Reeves had nowhere left to hide. 5 years earlier, Keanu Reeves, renowned actor known for his intense roles and genuine humility, had shocked the entertainment world by announcing his retirement from acting. Exhausted by decades in the spotlight and seeking authentic connection, he purchased a secluded property, a rustic chacara with sprawling grounds and a view of distant mountains. The decision had raised eyebrows in Hollywood, but those who knew him understood his desire for peace and normalcy after years of fame. What no one expected was that he would share this new chapter with Antonio, an elderly widower who had lived on the neighboring property for decades. Antonio's wife had passed 2 years prior, leaving him alone with his grief and memories. Their unlikely friendship began with simple neighborly gestures, Antonio offering homegrown vegetables, Keanu helping with repairs around the older man's home. Despite their age difference and vastly different backgrounds, they found common ground in their appreciation for simplicity, nature, and philosophical conversations under starlit skies. "Why would someone like you choose a place like this?" Antonio had asked one evening as they sat on Keanu's porch, watching fireflies dance above the tall grass. "Because here I'm just me," Keanu had answered simply. Not a character, not an image on a screen. Those early months had been exactly what Keanu sought. Quiet days restoring the old house, exploring the extensive grounds and enjoying genuine conversation with someone who treated him as a man, rather than an icon. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of public expectation lift from his shoulders. But 3 months into his rural retirement, Keanu noticed something unusual: unfamiliar tire tracks along the rarely used back road. Occasional flashes of light from the wooded area that separated his property from the eastern boundary, strange interference on his phone that came and went unpredictably. His years portraying vigilant, perceptive characters had honed real-world observational skills that now sparked his concern. Where others might have dismissed these anomalies, Keanu's intuition recognized patterns. "Have you ever noticed anything strange about this area?" he asked Antonio one day as they walked the property line. The older man hesitated before answering. "There used to be stories about the previous owners of your house. They weren't around much, but when they came, there was always unusual activity. Trucks arriving at night. People I'd never seen before." Keanu's curiosity intensified. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the property's oldest structures, he discovered something unexpected in an abandoned storage shed. Beneath a rotting wooden floor, a metal hatch led to a narrow tunnel reinforced with timber supports. Armed with only a flashlight and the same courage that had served him in countless action roles, Keanu followed the passage. It extended hundreds of meters before opening into a larger underground space equipped with what appeared to be surveillance technology, much of it outdated, but some surprisingly sophisticated. Maps on the wall connected his property to 3, others in the region with red lines, forming a network of interconnected points. Documents in filing cabinets revealed fragments of what seemed to be a long-running operation, monitoring communications, tracking shipments, surveilling specific individuals. Over the following weeks, Keanu pieced together a disturbing picture. His peaceful retirement home sat atop a node in an elaborate intelligence-gathering network. The property's strategic location, with its commanding view of the valley and proximity to the regional highway, made it ideal for monitoring activities in the area. More concerning were the references to the Professor and an organization identified only as the Institute in the documents. Their interests appeared to span from weapons development to technology theft, using the rural location as cover for their operations. Keanu faced a decision: report his findings to authorities and risk becoming entangled in a dangerous investigation, or quietly secure his and Antonio's safety without drawing attention. Before he could decide, he discovered surveillance equipment in his own house, tiny cameras hidden in light fixtures, microphones embedded in walls. They had been watching him all along, perhaps waiting to determine if he had discovered their secrets. The final confirmation came when he recognized one of the men from the surveillance photos at the local market. Watching him with calculated interest, Keanu understood then that his discovery of the tunnels had not gone unnoticed. That night, Keanu made a decision born of both his protective instincts and the strategic thinking he'd developed through his film roles. He would convert his retirement into a mission to protect Antonio and dismantle whatever operation had used this property for their purposes. "Antonio," he had said seriously as they shared a simple dinner, "I need to tell you something important about this place, and then I need to teach you how to be vigilant." The elderly man had listened with growing concern as Keanu revealed what he'd discovered. When he finished, Antonio surprised him with his response. "My Mercedes, my wife, used to say there was something not right about this valley. I thought she was just being superstitious." He had met Keanu's gaze with unexpected resolve. "I'm an old man, but I'm not useless. Tell me what we need to do." Thus began their unlikely partnership, the retired action star and the elderly widower, working together to understand and counter the mysterious organization that operated in the shadows around them. Keanu applied the tactical knowledge he'd gained from years of intense film roles, while Antonio contributed his deep knowledge of the land and community. What neither of them realized was how extensive the Institute's reach would prove to be, or how determined the professor would be to protect his operation when he discovered their interference. "You never intended to simply retire, did you?" the professor asked, studying Keanu's face with clinical interest. "You were looking for something all along." No, Keanu countered, his voice level despite the tension humming through him. I came here for peace. Finding your surveillance network was never part of my plan. They stood across from each other in the living room, the manila envelope between them like a ticking bomb. Outside, the storm had arrived, raindrops pelting against the windows in accusatory rhythms. Yet you took to counter-surveillance with remarkable skill for an actor, the professor observed, disabling our equipment, redirecting our data streams, even using our own cameras to feed us loops. Not exactly the actions of someone seeking rural tranquility. Keanu moved toward the fireplace, positioning himself where he could watch both the door and the window. You'd be surprised what you pick up after decades of action films. Technical advisors teach you things the studios never put on screen. And your friendship with the old man? Was that strategic too? There was genuine curiosity in the professor's question. Antonio is the only authentic thing about this place, Keanu answered, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. He deserved better than to spend his final years unknowingly surrounded by your operation. A door creaked at the back of the house, and they both tensed. Antonio appeared in the kitchen doorway, a steaming pot in his weathered hands. I made coffee, he announced, his gaze shifting between the two men. It seemed appropriate for a confrontation. The professor's eyebrows rose slightly. He's more involved than I was led to believe. I'm old, not invisible, Antonio replied sharply, setting the pot down. And this is my home too now. The simple declaration seemed to shift something in the room's dynamics. The professor accepted the offered cup, his calculated demeanor momentarily giving way to a more human acknowledgement. Once they were seated, Keanu and Antonio on one side, the professor on the other, the conversation resumed with new gravity. Your organization has been using these properties for at least 20 years, Keanu said. The tunnels connect to monitoring stations that cover the entire valley. What I can't figure out is why. This isn't exactly a strategic location. The professor sipped his coffee before answering. Not all valuable targets are obvious, Mr. Reeves. Sometimes the most important information flows through the most ordinary places. Like a rural highway that happens to connect 3 military research facilities, Antonio added quietly. Keanu and the professor both turned to him in surprise. My wife was a cleaner at one of them before we retired here, Antonio explained. She noticed the same vehicles passing through regularly, started writing down license plates as a hobby. He shrugged. Mercedes was always detail-oriented. The revelation hung in the air between them. Keanu had never known this about Antonio's wife, and clearly neither had the professor. Your interference has compromised years of data collection, the professor finally said, returning his attention to Keanu. The organization I represent has invested considerable resources here. Your organization bugged my house and threatened my friend, Keanu countered. Whatever intelligence operation you're running, it doesn't justify that. Intelligence operation? The professor's laugh held no humor. Is that what you think this is? Something so pedestrian as government spying? The way he said it sent a chill through Keanu. If not intelligence, then what? Before the professor could answer, headlights swept across the windows, a vehicle approaching up the long driveway. You said we had 12 hours, Keanu said sharply, rising to his feet. I did. The professor looked genuinely surprised as he checked his watch. Those aren't my people. Antonio moved to the window, peering out into the storm. It's Marcus, my nephew. He wasn't supposed to visit until next week. The unexpected arrival added a new complication to an already volatile situation. Keanu made a quick decision. Antonio, meet him outside. Tell him there's a problem with the roof leak again, and you need him to check the outbuilding first while I finish patching inside. It was a pre-arranged code they had established for danger. As Antonio went to intercept his nephew, Keanu turned back to the professor. Whatever you're planning, involving more innocent people isn't an option. Agreed. The professor's response was surprisingly immediate. Despite what you may think, unnecessary casualties have never been our objective. A crash of thunder shook the house, momentarily drowning out the sound of Antonio speaking with his nephew outside. In that brief silence, Keanu made a decision that would change everything. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had made him famous in action roles. "You're going to tell me exactly what the Institute is doing with the data collected here. Then you're going to dismantle your operation completely. In return, the evidence I've gathered stays buried." Evidence? The professor's composure slipped slightly. 3 hard drives of your surveillance data, records of every vehicle that's visited your monitoring stations, photos of your operatives. Keanu leaned forward. "Enough to expose whatever you're doing here to authorities in multiple countries." The professor's face revealed nothing, but his fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "You're bluffing." "I spent 20 years playing men who prepare for every contingency," Keanu replied. "What makes you think I'd approach this any differently?" They stared at each other across the coffee table, the storm raging outside, a fitting backdrop to the tension within. Finally, the professor set down his cup. "The Institute is not what you imagine," he said slowly. "We don't serve any government. We monitor threats that official agencies are too bureaucratic or compromised to address effectively. A private intelligence organization," Keanu supplied, "a necessary one." The professor's conviction seemed genuine. "The data collected here has prevented 3 major weapons deals and identified a network of technology theft that targeted research facilities across this region." The front door opened and Antonio returned alone, water dripping from his raincoat. "Marcus is checking the outbuilding. I told him to be thorough. We have 15 minutes at most." The professor glanced between them, reassessing the situation. "It seems I've underestimated the depth of your partnership." "Most people do," Antonio replied with unexpected steel in his voice. "They see an old man and a movie star and assume neither of us could be particularly dangerous." The comment hung in the air, carrying more weight than mere words should bear. In that moment, with rain lashing the windows and thunder rolling across the hills, the true nature of what Keanu and Antonio had built together became clear. Not just a friendship, but an alliance of complementary strengths. 15 minutes, Keanu echoed, returning to the matter at hand. "That's how long you have to convince us why we shouldn't expose your entire operation." The storm reached its peak as Antonio's nephew Marcus knocked urgently on the door, 15 minutes having elapsed far too quickly. The professor had just finished explaining the Institute's purpose, a privately funded organization monitoring threats that government agencies either missed or deliberately ignored due to political considerations. "Keanu," Antonio called from the window where he'd been keeping watch. "Marcus isn't alone anymore." A quick glance confirmed Antonio's observation. 3 black SUVs had pulled up behind Marcus's truck, their headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. "Your associates arrived early," Keanu said to the professor, tension evident in his voice. "Those aren't my people." The professor moved to the window, his composure slipping for the first time. "We use unmarked vehicles, never a convoy. That's someone else." Keanu made a split-second decision, years of action roles translating into real-world instinct. "Antonio, get your nephew and bring him inside, now." As Antonio hurried out into the storm, Keanu turned to the professor. "The tunnel entrance in the cellar, does it still connect to the outbuildings?" "Yes, but..." "Then that's our way out if needed." Keanu moved quickly to a cabinet, extracting a locked box he'd kept prepared. Inside was a satellite phone and several small devices that resembled smoke detectors. "Proximity sensors," he explained, seeing the professor's questioning look. "They'll tell us if anyone approaches the house from behind." Antonio returned with Marcus, both men soaked and confused. Marcus, a sturdy man in his 40s with his uncle's same observant eyes, looked between Keanu and the professor with immediate suspicion. "Someone want to explain what's happening?" he demanded. "There are men in tactical gear setting up a perimeter around the property." The professor moved to the window again, his expression darkening as he observed the new arrivals. "The consortium," he said quietly. "They must have tracked me here." "The who?" Antonio asked. "Our primary adversary, a corporate collective that profits from exactly the kind of threats we work to neutralize." The professor turned to face them. "They've been trying to identify our monitoring stations for years, and now they have," Keanu concluded grimly. with all of us conveniently gathered in one location. The situation crystallized with terrible clarity. They were trapped between the Institute and its enemies, with Antonio and his nephew caught in the crossfire of a conflict that had nothing to do with them. A flash of lightning illuminated figures moving through the rain toward the house, their methodical approach leaving no doubt about their intentions. "Antonio, Marcus," Keanu said with calm authority, "take the professor through the tunnel. There's an exit near the eastern property line that should be clear. Get to town and contact this number." He handed Antonio the satellite phone. "Tell them exactly what's happening." Antonio's weathered face showed no fear, only determination. "And you?" "I'll buy you time," Keanu replied simply. "That's a suicide mission," the professor objected. "There are at least 8 operatives out there." "I've faced worse." "Odds in movies," Keanu said with a hint of his familiar wry smile. "This isn't a film," Marcus pointed out. "No," Keanu agreed, "but those men out there don't know that. They know me as an action star. Let's use that psychology against them." Antonio placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "We're not leaving you behind." The simple declaration, delivered with quiet dignity, momentarily stunned Keanu. After years in Hollywood where relationships were often transactional, the loyalty of this elderly man who owed him nothing struck him profoundly. "We need a better plan," Marcus said practically. "One that doesn't involve sacrifice." The professor, who had been studying the approaching figures with professional assessment, turned back to them. "I have an alternative suggestion, one that uses all our strengths." As he outlined his strategy, Keanu recognized elements from his own films: misdirection, strategic positioning, psychological advantage, blended with the professor's tactical knowledge. It was risky, but far better than his initial desperate plan. "It might work," Keanu conceded, "but it depends on perfect timing, and on them not expecting cooperation between us," the professor added. Antonio, who had been listening intently, nodded. "They won't expect an old man to be useful at all. That's always been my advantage." The plan required them to separate, Antonio and Marcus to the tunnels to create a diversion from below, the professor to the attic with communications equipment to convince the consortium that Institute reinforcements were inbound, and Keanu, using the skills he'd honed through decades of action roles, to create the impression of multiple defenders within the house. As they prepared to take their positions, Keanu found himself face to face with Antonio one last time before the older man descended to the tunnels. "When I came here seeking peace, I never imagined this," Keanu admitted. "I've put you in danger." Antonio's eyes crinkled with unexpected warmth. "Before you arrived, I was slowly fading away with my grief. Now I feel alive again." He clasped Keanu's shoulder firmly. "My Mercedes would have liked you. She always said life should be an adventure, even at our age." The simple truth of this friendship, forged in unusual circumstances but genuine in its foundation, gave Keanu a clarity he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about his celebrity or his past roles. It was about protecting someone who had become important to him. "See you on the other side of this, my friend," Keanu said, the words carrying more emotional weight than he'd expected. As Antonio and Marcus disappeared into the tunnel entrance, the professor paused before heading to his position. "You really did just want retirement, didn't you?" he asked, studying Keanu with new understanding. "I wanted connection," Keanu corrected. "Turns out I found it in the last place I expected." The first attackers reached the porch as thunder cracked overhead, nature's dramatic timing providing the perfect backdrop for what was to come. Keanu Reeves, who had spent decades portraying heroes on screen, moved into position to become one in reality, not through spectacular stunts or impossible feats, but through calculated strategy and the protection of an unexpected friendship that had given new purpose to his retirement. The storm reached its crescendo as the confrontation began. Rain lashing against the windows like nature itself was invested in the outcome. What followed would test every skill Keanu had ever learned on set, but with one crucial difference. This time there would be no second takes. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees surrounding the chakra, casting dappled patterns across the repaired porch where Keanu and Antonio sat, with cups of steaming coffee. 3 months had passed since the night of the storm and the confrontation that had transformed their quiet existence. The professor stood at the edge of the property, speaking quietly into a secure phone, his tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. After the events of that night, the successful misdirection that had convinced the consortium that the property was an elaborate trap, the strategic alliance between former adversaries, the unexpected intervention of the Institute's reinforcements that Antonio had managed to contact, an uneasy truce had formed. "He's leaving today," Antonio observed, nodding toward the professor. "Back to whatever shadows the Institute operates in," Keanu agreed. "Though I think we've earned a certain level of trust." The property showed few signs of the confrontation now. The damaged outbuildings had been repaired, the surveillance equipment dismantled and removed, the tunnel entrances secured but preserved, a precaution all had agreed was wise. "Will they come back? The consortium?" Antonio asked the question. That lingered despite their victory. The professor says no, with the Institute officially acknowledging this location and placing it under their protection, it would be too risky for them. Keanu sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Besides, the data that made this place valuable has been relocated. We're just an empty node now." Antonio nodded, his weathered face peaceful despite all they had endured. "And you? Will you stay now that the danger has passed?" The question touched on something Keanu had been contemplating since that night. His search for a quiet retirement had led him instead to unexpected purpose, protecting Antonio, confronting the Institute, finding a use for the skills he'd developed through decades in action roles. "I came here looking for peace," Keanu said slowly. "What I found was something more valuable, meaning." He met his friend's gaze. "Yes, I'm staying, if you'll still have me as a neighbor." Antonio's smile carried the wisdom of his years. "My house is too big for just one old man. The guest room is yours for as long as you want it." The professor approached, having finished his call. His formal demeanor had softened over the months of recovery and negotiation. "It's done," he announced. "The Institute has officially redesignated this area. Your property will remain under our distant protection, but all active operations have been transferred elsewhere." "And the consortium?" Keanu asked. "They believe this was a calculated trap from the beginning. Your reputation as an action star proved surprisingly useful in convincing them that confronting you directly was ill-advised." A hint of respect colored the professor's tone. "Sometimes perception is more powerful than reality." Antonio rose, his movements spry despite his age. "I'll get more coffee. This feels like a moment worth marking properly." When he had gone inside, the professor turned to Keanu with unexpected candor. "You could have exposed us completely. The evidence you gathered was substantial. And you could have eliminated us as threats to your operation," Keanu countered. "We both chose a better path." "Indeed." The professor extended his hand. "The Institute could use someone with your particular set of skills, Mr. Reeves. Should you ever tire of retirement again?" Keanu accepted the handshake with a wry smile. "I think I've found my role here, but I appreciate the offer." As the professor departed down the long driveway, Antonio returned with fresh coffee and a plate of homemade bread. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise fully over the property that had become so much more than a retirement home. "What now?" Antonio finally asked. Keanu considered the question, looking out over the land that had brought him both challenge and purpose. "Now we live, old friend, not just exist. Live." In the distance, Marcus's truck appeared, bringing supplies and news from town. Another day in their unconventional life was beginning, quieter than the night of the storm perhaps, but no less meaningful for it. Keanu Reeves, who had portrayed so many heroes on screen, had found an unexpected truth in his retirement, that real heroism often came not through spectacular action, but through the choice to protect what matters, to stand firm when challenged, and to recognize the profound value of genuine connection. As Antonio rose to greet his nephew, Keanu remained on the porch for a moment longer, savoring the peace he had finally found, not the empty quiet he had initially sought, but something richer, a life with purpose, friendship, and the knowledge that sometimes the most meaningful roles are the ones we never expected to play.